Now back to where reason does rule. Sometimes, I hope, politics. Well, maybe it doesn't. We've heard a lot lately about the troubles in the Labor Party. Labor leader Anthony Albanese not cutting it, not being popular at all in the polls, having to reshuffle his team last week, replacing his extremist global warming spokesman Mark Butler, pretending that he was not being so extreme himself on policy. But I have to think, that Albanese is struggling. And I think that Tanya Plibersek would make a better match against the blokey Prime Minister Scott Morrison if she could at least ditch some of her inner city leftist vibe. So Albanese is in a bit of trouble, but there's one small caution, I think, against counting him out. News poll today. Sure, it said that Albanese was way less popular than the Prime Minister, but the two parties, Labor and the Coalition, actually dead level, 50-50. Well, they have to ask, can that actually be right? And how long before Conservatives, though, start to get a bit restless about Morrison and start turning the subject to the Liberals? Sure, he's very popular, and that always makes people fall into line. He looks a winner. But today, for instance, he gave a very, this big speech about, my road ahead for 2021, saying that his global warming aim was to have net zero emissions by 2050. Can you imagine the revolt in the Liberal Party if Malcolm Turnbull had said that? And on the weekend, former Minister Kevin Andrews, a Conservative, became the first sitting federal Liberal MP in decades in Victoria to lose his pre-selection, and to lose it to someone backed by the soft left of the Liberals. Keith Wolahan, a barrister and former Special Forces veteran who served in Afghanistan. Remarkably, Andrews was beaten despite having the backing of Treasurer Josh Frydenberg and no fewer than 3 Liberal Prime Ministers. The whole establishment, of course not Malcolm Turnbull, he's no longer a Liberal, I think, but this guy had the backing of Morrison, Kevin Andrews had the backing of Scott Morrison, John Howard, Tony Abbott, and still lost. Joining me is my politics panel, former Victorian Liberal President Michael Kroger and former New South Wales Labor Treasurer Michael Costa. Michael Kroger, Kevin Andrews got all that backing from the establishment, from number counters of the right, like Michael Sukkar, still got beaten and beaten badly. Tell me why.
Well, I'll tell you why. As good as Kevin was and as good as he has been, and where even those that voted against him are great fans of the distinguished career he's had, the Victorian Liberal Party has a history of pursuing renewal. And I was president in 1989. We knocked off Roger Shipton in Higgins. He'd only been there 15 years. The next day, Ian McPhee was beaten in Goldstein. He'd been there 15 years. The next day, a Sunday, Ken Aldred lost pre-selection in Bruce. He'd been an MP for 11 years. And a few months later, Senator David Hamer lost pre-selection. He'd been there 19 years. So 15, 15, 11 and 19, 4 safe seats. Kevin, as good as he's been, has been there 30 years, looking for another 3. And in the eyes of many, that was just a bridge too far. And, one other thing to remember, he hasn't been beaten by a plotter. The fellow that won, Keith Wolahan, is an exceptionally good candidate, and he'll do a very good job. And I know from what happened in Higgins all those years ago when people said to Roger Shipton to his face, yes, of course we're voting for you, Roger. They couldn't bring themselves to tell the sitting member that they were going to vote for Peter Costello. And I'm sure that what happened yesterday when people thought it was all going to be close, I was told, I wasn't a delegate, I wasn't there, but I was told it would be close. It was because a lot of people didn't want to say to the sitting member that they weren't going to vote for him, because it's a hard thing to do. It's a family down here, and they voted for Keith Wolahan, who, as I said, is going to be a very, very, very good member of Parliament.
Okay, I'll defer judgment as to whether this is sort of reflective of a move to the left within the Liberal Party. But on top of that, Michael Costa, there's Scott Morrison saying today that he'd like Australia to be carbon neutral by 2050, provided, the sums all worked out. He's got a little escape hatch there. I would have thought the Liberal right wing or the Conservatives would have torn into Malcolm Turnbull if he'd said that. Why is it taking it from Morrison?
Well, obviously because he's a winner and he can deliver. But look, I've got to say, I read his speech today, and it could have been delivered by a right-wing Labor person apart from that particular environmental commitment, because Labor, of course, has got a more bold or crazy, whatever word you want to use, commitment in terms of climate change. But the rest of it, I thought was, very wishy-washy. I mean, debt's no longer an issue. It was a very, how can I put it, moderate speech by somebody who's very comfortable and looks like he's on the path to re-election. There's nothing bold in any of what was said today. I was quite surprised by that. I mean, debt's no longer an issue, and that to me is frightening, to be honest with you.
Well, that is the Labor problem, isn't it, Michael Kroger, that in a sense, Scott Morrison is in many ways a right-wing Labor sort of leader. That leaves them nowhere to go unless they're more sensible than Scott Morrison, and they're going down the rabbit hole of trying to be more on the left, and I don't know that that's going to win them anything. So I wonder, I ask you, is that the problem, and does Newspoll actually reflect the truth when it says, well, actually, it's Labor and the Liberals dead even?
No, I don't think he's a right-wing Labor leader at all. I think he's a very traditional Liberal leader in the Howard mould. He wants less taxes, he wants less regulation, he wants more freedom, etc., etc. I don't think there's any. He wants industrial relations reform. I don't think there's anything Labor about him whatsoever. But I think the answer is in relation to net zero by 50, and like all these things, Andrew, as you know as well as anyone, that sounds great. I think Scott Morrison wants to put some meat on the bone before we all fall in love with this wonderful international theory that this is how we're going to get there. And that great Jonathan Lee question, which rings in the ears of every person who watched it when he interviewed Bill Shorten, questioned Bill Shorten before that election. How much is this going to cost, Mr Shorten? And once Morrison declares that this is a target rather than aspiration, he'll get asked, how much is this going to cost? And, to Scott's credit, I think they're doing the work behind the scenes now. And if the politicians were genuinely honest, they'd say, this is what it'll cost in 25, in 35, 45, 50. So everyone can see the jobs threatened and the economic cost going all over to 2050, which is the only way people can actually understand why this aspiration has a lot of pain attached to it that at this stage no one has any idea about.
I think you're probably right. He can play Labor. I mean, if Labor was sensible, they'd have exactly the same policy with exactly the same get-out clause, and that would give us two Labor right parties, one calling themselves the Liberals, Michael Costa. I mean, exactly. For all this claim that Michael Kroger made that, the Liberals believe in, industrial relations reform. They do believe in some changes, but I'm not seeing bold changes on that front. What is the essential difference?
Well, I don't see any essential difference other than on the margin in industrial relations. Obviously, the Liberal Party's upset some sections of the union movement in terms of its consolidation of industrial relations legislation. But look, the bottom line is if you actually look at the economic policies, it's a question of who's going to spend more and who's spending more responsibly. It's not a question of getting the budget back into control. And you also look at the sort of economic policy that underpinned that speech. It was all about airy-fairy technological change, somehow increasing productivity. I mean, I've got to say to you, Andrew, they are very close to being exactly the same party, apart from climate change and some minor things in industrial relations.
Well, there is one change, I guess, that the Labor wants to keep the spout of government assistance going, things like JobKeeper. They want to spend even more. Morrison says no, the money's got to come off. The aid's got to come out in March. But Michael Kroger, I wonder if that's possible when you've got states like Western Australia recklessly shutting down whole cities after just a single case of coronavirus.
That's quite terrific. What a disgrace. This fellow McGowan just panics. At the first sign of a problem, he panics and he's got to stop panicking. One case and he's causing untold tens of millions of dollars of damage to the Western Australian economy. It's why people have morphed behind Gladys Berejiklian in New South Wales. She fully understands if there's a problem, you isolate it, you contact trace it, you quarantine, you end it, then you reopen. This bloke with a stroke of the pen that closes down the whole of Perth and surrounding suburbs on the basis of one case. Look, we're going to have this virus for years, and if McGowan keeps panicking the way he does, he's lucky he's got the mining industry in Western Australia, otherwise the whole place would be a ghost town, the way he's going. I mean, he's just got to stop panicking and scaring the living daylights out of people and damaging the Western Australian economy.
Yeah, you say it's panic. I wonder whether it's learned the lesson of Victoria that harsh measures make people love. They like the smack of the shambok on their back. And,
true.
I don't know whether...
And Queensland.
That's it. And Queensland indeed. Michael Kroger, Michael Costa, thank you both so much for your time.
Thanks,
Andrew.